When Allied troops advanced into the heart of the Reich in the early months of 1945, reports of starving prisoners and abandoned labor camps were fragmentary, almost always vague and difficult to verify. No one in the high command could imagine the true scale of what they were about to find. Winter was slowly receding, and as the snow melted, roads opened by the fighting revealed columns of exhausted civilians, freed prisoners wandering aimlessly, and makeshift barracks that seemed empty from a distance. Only upon approaching could one perceive the unnatural stillness, that silence which belongs to no living human settlement. British, American, and Soviet soldiers later spoke of a sensation of stopped air, as if time itself had been violently interrupted. The first major revelation came with the discovery of thousands of bodies around camps like Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Auschwitz. The German retreat had been hasty, chaotic, but also deliberately cruel. In many places, SS personnel had abandoned prisoners without food, water, or medical care for days or weeks. When Allied regiments entered the complexes, they encountered people too weak to stand, barracks converted into makeshift hospitals, and courtyards filled with corpses in various stages of decomposition. The smell, according to the soldiers' accounts, could be detected hundreds of meters away, a mixture of disease, hunger, and death that permeated every corner. At Bergen-Belsen, where a typhus epidemic had devastated prisoners in recent months, the scene was particularly overwhelming. The opened mass graves showed overlapping layers of bodies, many barely covered with soil. British soldiers filming the site described how some corpses still retained expressions reflecting recent agony. In Dachau, long rows of bodies stacked next to the crematorium left US officers speechless. The machinery meant to destroy evidence had been overwhelmed by the number of dead and stopped due to lack of fuel. The result was a horrifying landscape, a physical testament to a system designed to annihilate humans on an industrial scale. The Soviets, upon liberating Auschwitz, had already witnessed the horror of Majdanek months earlier and were not unprepared. Yet what they found in the largest extermination complex of the Nazi regime surpassed any expectation. Warehouses full of personal belongings, packaged human hair, piles of shoes, and human remains in damaged crematoria testified to a systematic operation that had functioned for years. Although the Nazis attempted to destroy evidence during their retreat by blowing up gas chambers, burning documents, and emptying barracks, the magnitude of the crime could not be hidden. In some sectors, the Soviets discovered bones mixed with soil in trenches where the SS had attempted to incinerate bodies in the open air. The first minutes after entry were, for most soldiers, one of complete bewilderment. Many were 18 or 19 years old with no prior experience of genocide scenes. Some vomited, others cried uncontrollably, and several remained in complete silence. Later, medical and military reports note that the dominant feeling was not just horror but disbelief. It was hard to accept that humans had deliberately caused this. Even troops hardened in urban combat or on the Pacific Front acknowledged that they had never seen anything comparable. A US infantryman at Buchenwald wrote that there was not enough air to scream at the sight of hundreds of corpses piled like logs in an outdoor depot. Inside the camps, searching for mass graves was an urgent process. Concern for sanitary risks was real. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis epidemics threatened to spread into Allied ranks. Military doctors ordered rapid inspections of the grounds. In many places, the soil was disturbed, with darker patches indicating recent burials. Mass graves were often long trenches, forcibly dug by prisoners before dying or being killed. Upon opening, Allied teams found bodies in disorder, unclothed or wrapped in tiny blankets, some still covered with lime. The mountains of corpses beside the barracks revealed that during the final days the SS had simply left the dead where they fell, either unable or indifferent to continue the process of elimination. The documentation began immediately. The officers knew that these findings had to be recorded as irrefutable evidence. Film crews, military photographers, and war correspondents were sent to capture every corner of the camps. Images of soldiers walking among bodies, open graves, and survivors in extreme conditions would later become part of the harshest historical archives of the 20th century. The Allies did not know at the time that these images would be essential for post-war trials. They only knew that what they were witnessing should not disappear with time or be subject to later interpretations. As the troops advanced, the pattern repeated: abandoned camps, corpses outside, partially covered mass graves, halted crematoria, and survivors too weak to speak. Each discovery was further confirmation that this was not a series of isolated abuses, but the result of a structured policy of extermination. Intelligence officer reports noted that the number of bodies was so large that counting them individually was impossible. Only piles, volumes, and accumulation zones could be estimated. Camp sectors were classified according to the density of remains and marked with stakes for later studies. Survivor testimonies provided context. Many recounted how, in the days before the Allies arrived, prisoners were dying at such a fast pace that there was no personnel left to remove them. Others described being forced to drag bodies to improvised graves or stack them near the crematorium, waiting for incineration that never came. Epidemics accelerated the crisis. Corpses remained for hours or days alongside the living, creating an unbearable environment. Allied soldiers noted that in some barracks, the silence was so absolute that it was not immediately clear who was alive and who was not. Some camps presented even more shocking scenes: stopped train cars with dozens of bodies inside, the result of failed evacuations or abandoned transports. Soldiers opening these cars described the interior as a sealed hell, a place where heat and lack of air had killed everyone before reaching the destination. Opening these trains added another dimension to the tragedy, showing that death did not occur only within the camp perimeter but also during forced transports. The overall picture was desolate. Mass graves numbered in the dozens in each camp, sometimes hundreds in the largest. There were areas where the terrain looked like an endless series of collective graves. Soldiers marked the boundaries with improvised tape, aware that they were walking over places where thousands had been buried without names or ceremony. The recording process was mechanical, almost automatic, as there was no time to stop at each body. The priority was to prevent the sanitary situation from worsening and to rescue survivors before they died too. This first encounter with the physical magnitude of the genocide profoundly affected all who experienced it. It left an emotional imprint that many would carry for the rest of their lives. Some veterans confessed decades later that no other war experience, neither bombings nor ambushes, nor seeing their own dead comrades, compared to the feeling of walking among thousands of innocent victims left in those silent grounds. And as bodies continued to be counted, filmed and marked, a disturbing question arose: how to identify each person amid such dehumanization. The impossible identification: nameless, documentless bodies in an advanced state of decomposition. When the medical, forensic, and military teams of the Allied armies began assessing the scale of the bodies found in the camps, one reality became immediately clear: most of the victims could not be identified. The physical collapse of the prisoners during the final months of the war had destroyed any trace of individuality in their faces, hands and bodies weakened to the extreme. But beyond the visible devastation, there was a structural reason, designed from the earliest stages of the camp system, that made identification an almost insurmountable challenge. The Nazi machinery had deliberately worked to erase the existence of each person even before ending their life. From their entry into the concentration system, prisoners were stripped of their belongings, documents, photographs, letters, medals, family garments, anything that could have personal or identifying value. Their suitcases were confiscated, their clothing replaced with generic uniforms, and their items distributed among warehouses intended to send materials to the Reich. This process was not only economic, it was a mechanism of dehumanization. When the Allies encountered naked or barely covered bodies, what they were seeing was the final result of this policy: thousands of people with nothing indicating who they had been. The problem was compounded by decomposition. In many camps, corpses had been exposed outdoors for weeks. Epidemics had caused mass deaths in a matter of days, and SS guards, overwhelmed or already fleeing, had left the bodies unburied. Temperature variations between March and April, from terrible night cold to blazing midday sun, accelerated decay. In other locations, the soil dug for mass graves had been poorly compacted, allowing water to infiltrate and further damage human remains. Forensic teams recorded that in some cases it was no longer possible to distinguish facial features, exact ages, or differentiated body structures. Prisoner tattoos in Auschwitz seemed, in theory, a method of identification, but even they presented problems. First, only a portion of deportees were tattooed. Second, skin deterioration or burns caused by SS efforts to incinerate evidence had erased or distorted many numbers. Third, internal records, such as prisoner lists, censuses, or administrative files, had mostly been destroyed during evacuations. In several complexes, the Germans burned entire offices before fleeing. So even when a tattoo was legible, the record linking it to a name was missing. Military doctors had to improvise rudimentary classification systems. In Buchenwald, for example, bodies were separated according to location, attempting to reconstruct who had been in which barrack. In some cases, numbers sewn or painted on garments could suggest the block to which they belonged. But the connection between block and name remained imprecise due to constant prisoner rotation, daily deaths, and changes in function within the camp. It was common for a prisoner to be moved from one barrack to another several times in the same month, depending on space availability, illness, or labor needs. The situation became even more difficult when corpses came from mass graves. There, bodies were mixed, stacked without order, sometimes including remains of people who had died on different dates. Forensic teams knew that exhuming each grave was impractical. The health risk was too high, the number of bodies too large, and time too limited. In many camps, Allied orders were clear: document visually, record generally, and proceed with collective burials. Individualization was relegated to exceptional cases where clear evidence of identity existed. Some survivors tried to help. They approached Allied teams, pointing out people who were their blockmates, friends, or relatives. But in most cases, this effort was useless. Physical changes caused by extreme malnutrition, such as sunken faces, skin clinging to bones, and complete muscle loss, had practically erased any resemblance to the person they had been months earlier. Many prisoners reported that in the final weeks, they could no longer recognize even those sleeping next to them. Death, in that sense, only accentuated a process of depersonalization that had begun much earlier. Clothing offered no answers either. Striped uniforms were almost identical, and when prisoners retained any civilian clothing, it was usually torn, dirty, or altered to withstand winter. The small fabric triangle identifying Jews, political prisoners, Roma, or Jehovah's Witnesses was sometimes still visible but provided no personal information. It only indicated the reason for their classification according to Nazi logic. The yellow, red, pink, green triangle all revealed the bureaucratic cruelty of the system, not the real identity of those who wore them. The few exceptions occurred when bodies retained hidden objects. Some prisoners had risked their lives keeping a ring, a tiny photo, a folded letter, or a piece of paper with a name. These items sometimes appeared among corpses or among survivors about to die. The Allies collected them in marked boxes, hoping to one day return them to families. But the scale was so immense that the possibility of establishing concrete matches was practically nil. After the war, some of these objects ended up in museums, others in historical archives, and some were never claimed. The military authorities also faced another problem. Many bodies belonged to people who had never been registered in any civil system, deported from destroyed ghettos, torn from small towns, moved without documents, or born within the camp system itself. In these cases, even if the corpse had retained identifiable features, there was no prior record to compare it with. The destruction of municipal archives, censuses, and civil documents during the war added another gap impossible to fill. And in the eastern territories, where the Nazis had committed systematic massacres, much of the Jewish communities left no documentary trace. Allied forensic teams were unprepared for such a scenario. The forensic medicine of the time had no protocols for the mass analysis of extremely weakened or decomposed bodies. Modern identification technologies such as DNA did not exist either. Traditional methods, whether fingerprints, facial recognition, or dental analysis, were difficult to apply in most cases. Fingerprints were lost due to damaged skin, teeth were deteriorated by extreme hunger or disease, and facial features were irreversibly altered. Even in relatively preserved bodies, the lack of comparative records made the procedure useless. In some camps, Allied commanders ordered the creation of lists of living prisoners to at least reconstruct the identity of those who had survived. The intention was to establish a counterpoint to the estimated number of dead, creating a kind of human map of the disaster. But that tool only worked forward. It could not give names to those who had already died. Thus, the documentary void became a second death, An administrative disappearance added to physical death. The emotional shock also affected the team's ability to work. Many doctors described how the sight of hundreds of nameless bodies made them feel as if they were witnessing the total destruction of the concept of personhood. There were no symbols, no stories, no ages that allowed imagining a life behind each face. Only a mass of anonymous humanity, destroyed by a system that had turned identity into an obstacle. The Nazi administration had achieved its goal, erasing each individual before killing them. In the face of this reality, the medical and forensic community understood that the priority could not be nominal identification. The goal had to be to document patterns, causes of death, signs of mistreatment, bone injuries, traces of execution, everything that allowed understanding how the mechanism of extermination worked. The nameless bodies thus became physical witnesses of a collective crime. Although most would never regain their individual identity, their state provided crucial information about the conditions in the camps and the methods used by the SS. Despite the efforts and dedication of many technicians, the practical conclusion was devastating. The Allies only managed to identify a minimal fraction of the victims found. The rest would be buried in orderly graves, with plaques without names, numbered only by location and date. Thousands of families in Europe and the Jewish diaspora would never know where the bodies of their loved ones were. The use of bulldozers to bury bodies in mass. When the Allies took full control of the newly liberated camps, the first impression was that everything had to be resolved quickly, almost immediately. The combination of thousands of exposed corpses, survivors in critical condition, and barracks infested with diseases turned each camp into a sanitary bomb ready to explode. Military doctors warned that if action was not taken swiftly, typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery would not only ravage the weakened prisoners but could also spread to the soldiers themselves. The risk of a massive epidemic was real, and the officers knew that the decisions they made within hours could determine the life or death of thousands more. The scene at Bergen-Belsen was the most emblematic, not because it was the only one, but because it was extensively recorded. There, the British encountered a camp where the corpses numbered in the thousands. They were on the roads, in the yards, between the barracks, around the crematoria, and in half-filled pits. The hasty withdrawal of the SS had left the place in a state of total collapse. Many bodies were in an advanced stage of decomposition. Others, more recent, lay where they had fallen, victims of hunger, disease, or lack of water in the days before liberation. The British knew they could not wait. Survivors needed urgent medical care, food, hydration, and clean areas for treatment. With each passing hour, the presence of so many exposed corpses worsened environmental contamination. Officers ordered the immediate deployment of heavy vehicles, including bulldozers, to move earth and create pits large enough to contain hundreds of bodies. The decision, painful as it was inevitable. No human team could bury so many corpses manually without risking their own lives. Bulldozers were machines associated with construction, earth moving on civil works, or clearing roads after bombings. But in these places, they became symbols of an urgency that admitted no pauses. In the footage taken by the British units, the slow, mechanical movement of the shovels pushing bodies into the open pits is visible. Many soldiers who witnessed the scene described a sense of unreality, as if they were seeing something no human being should ever see or do. Some veterans recounted decades later that it was the most traumatic task of their entire military experience, even more than combat. Medical and sanitary officials justified the procedure in their reports. There was no other way to contain the sanitary danger. The extremely weakened survivors could not participate in cleaning tasks, nor was it morally acceptable to ask them to do so. The British teams were horrified to discover that for weeks, prisoners had been forced by the SS to drag corpses, dig trenches, or transport bodies for cremation. Repeating this practice, even under Allied orders, was unthinkable. The only real alternative was therefore to use heavy machinery. The process began by identifying sectors of the camp where the soil was softer or where trenches already existed that could be expanded. The British selected areas away from barracks intended to become temporary hospitals. The goal was to create safe spaces where survivors could recover without being exposed to the constant contamination of decomposing bodies. Within hours, the bulldozers began pushing large amounts of earth, opening deep pits. The filming teams documented every movement, aware that these images would be essential to demonstrate the magnitude of the Nazi crime to the world. Bodies were dragged into the pits uniformly, trying to maintain some order to avoid chaotic accumulation. However, the task was impossible to execute delicately. The machine's force and the fragile state of many corpses hindered any attempt at individual care. The soldiers operating the vehicles avoided looking directly, focusing on the controls, the signals from medical staff, and the urgent need to finish. Some of them noted in their diaries that they felt a mixture of guilt and resignation. They knew they were doing something necessary but emotionally impossible to accept. In other camps, such as Dachau and Buchenwald, the use of heavy machinery was also necessary, although on a smaller scale. There, part of the work was carried out by prisoners who insisted on helping not out of obligation but out of a personal desire to organize the chaos or dignify the dead. Later testimonies recount that some survivors asked the Allies to allow them to cover the bodies with blankets, clothes, or fabrics before being transported. Sometimes this was granted, other times, for sanitary reasons, it was not possible. But the gesture showed that even in the midst of horror, there existed a human impulse of respect towards those who had shared the nightmare of the camp. In territories liberated by the Soviets, the procedure varied depending on the situation. In Auschwitz, for example, most of the bodies had already been incinerated or removed by the SS before the Red Army arrived. However, in places like Majdanek or Sobibor, where the SS did not have enough time to erase the evidence, graves were also found containing human remains mixed with ashes, soil, and bone fragments. The Soviets, like the British and Americans, used heavy machinery to close graves or create new ones, but their visual documentation was smaller due to the different approach of their information apparatus and their immediate priority to advance militarily towards Berlin. The graves opened by the Allies followed certain basic criteria: a minimum depth sufficient to avoid accidental exhumations, a safe distance from the inhabited areas of the camp, and clear signage for future use. Although the priority was sanitary, there was also an intention to preserve these sites as later evidence. For this reason, in many cases, stakes, ground markings, and written records of location were placed. Officers knew that once the war ended, international courts would need clear, physical, indisputable evidence. Collective graves thus became silent archives of the genocide. The emotional reaction of German civilians forced to witness or participate in these tasks would become significant later, but even in this chapter it was observed that some local residents showed total bewilderment. In villages near Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, residents claimed to have known nothing. When they saw bulldozers moving bodies, many were paralyzed, unable to understand that such horror had occurred just a few kilometers from their homes. The Allies, however, considered it vital that they saw it with their own eyes. One of the deepest dilemmas faced by Allied commanders was the symbolism of the act. The machinery that normally served to build roads or buildings was now being used to bury victims of a mass crime. Some officers feared that this act could be interpreted as an additional depersonalization of the victims. Others, on the contrary, believed that it was precisely a powerful testimony to the magnitude of the genocide. Nothing less than heavy machinery could handle the scale of the disaster. In the long term, that image would become one of the most iconic records of the liberation of the camps. Bulldozers marked a turning point in handling the remains. Without them, the epidemic would have wiped out survivors and perhaps even Allied troops. But the moral impact persisted for decades. Many soldiers declared that, despite understanding the sanitary necessity, they could never forget the mechanical movement of the earth covering bodies that had been living people weeks before. Each shovel of earth was proof that the Nazi system had produced a quantity of death for which no society was prepared. As the graves were covered and marked, the camps began to transform. Barracks were converted into makeshift hospitals, military kitchens replaced old dining halls, and Allied doctors worked tirelessly to save those who still had a chance of survival. But around these new living areas remained the visible scars of mass burials, silent reminders of what had occurred. The improvised cemeteries created around the fields. When the Allies managed to contain the immediate health danger after the liberation of the camps, a problem arose that could not be ignored: how to provide a dignified, albeit minimal, burial for tens of thousands of people who had died namelessly, without rituals, without farewell. The answer, in most cases, was the creation of improvised cemeteries around the concentration and extermination camps themselves. They were not places of calm or beauty, but of urgency, memory, and forced silence. The war was not yet over, but there, in those spaces marked by wooden stakes and fresh mounds of earth, a new phase of historical responsibility began. The first improvised cemeteries literally appeared a few meters from the camp walls. The priority was to maintain enough distance to avoid additional contamination, but not so much as to lose control of the area. In Bergen-Belsen, the British marked sections of land where bulldozer-dug pits were transformed into numbered mass graves. Wooden posts were erected with signs indicating approximate numbers: 500 bodies, 1,000 bodies, 2,000 bodies. Soldiers wrote the numbers with black paint or charcoal, without ceremonies or speeches. There was no time for elaborate rituals. Urgency imposed a cold, methodical pace. Yet even in this improvisation, there was an effort to preserve a minimal notion of dignity. In some camps, rows of simple crosses were placed, even though the victims were Jewish, Polish, Soviet, or of any other religious background, because these were the materials available. It was not about imposing a Christian symbol, but marking the place where human beings had been buried. Sometimes a Star of David made from two tied branches was added, placed by survivors who, despite extreme weakness, wished to participate in the process. The Allies allowed it when health conditions permitted, aware that the gesture carried immense emotional value. In Dachau, the Americans organized several burial zones near the Amper River, where the soil was softer. Rows of rectangular pits were dug. Each pit held between a dozen and several hundred bodies, depending on decomposition and sanitary urgency. Officers recorded the area on rudimentary military maps, drawing lines with pencil and noting approximate coordinates. These documents would later be used to create permanent cemeteries, but at the time they only served to avoid the total loss of physical trace. In Buchenwald, the process had a different dimension due to the active participation of the survivors themselves. Unlike other camps where prisoners were too weak to work, in Buchenwald there were groups that insisted on helping bury their companions. They did not want the dead to be treated like rubble. They wanted to accompany them, even if only one last time on their final journey. The Americans granted this request, allowing small groups of prisoners to help cover the pits with shovels and soil. The task was slow and painful. Many survivors could hold the shovel for only a few minutes before collapsing, but they persisted. For them, the act was a gesture of humanity amid disaster. In the territories liberated by the Soviets, improvised cemeteries followed a different logic. In Auschwitz, for example, most of the corpses found corresponded to the last days before liberation, as the Nazis had managed to destroy much of the evidence. Still, mass graves were created near damaged crematoria, where bone fragments mixed with ashes that could no longer be classified were deposited. The Soviets placed wooden signs with inscriptions in Russian and Polish indicating the estimated number of victims, although these figures were approximations based more on visual calculation than precise counts. One of the most significant aspects of these improvised cemeteries was their visibility. The Allies wanted the local population to see them, to be part of the immediate geography. They were not hidden or camouflaged under vegetation. The open and freshly covered pits remained in view of villagers, peasants, and citizens traveling the nearby roads. This was no accident. It was part of an explicit policy that no one could claim ignorance of what had occurred behind the camp walls. The disturbed earth, lined mounds, and improvised crosses were an undeniable physical reminder. Over the weeks, the improvised cemeteries began to take on more orderly forms. The Allies, once the health risk was under control, focused on establishing more formal records. In Bergen-Belsen, lists of numbered graves were drawn up, more accurate maps were made, and fences were installed around some areas. Temporary plaques were also placed, which, although they did not contain names, marked the date of burial and the approximate number of victims. These first markers would years later become part of the official memorials that are visited at these sites today. In Dachau, the US Army worked with local Jewish communities and international aid organizations to establish a more structured burial area. Trees were planted around the areas intended to become permanent cemeteries, with the aim of creating a more respectful environment in the future. Even though the victims had no individual names, their collective memory was to be honored. Some improvised religious ceremonies took place when military rabbis arrived at the camps. These rabbis recited the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, even though they did not know the identity of those lying in the graves. It was a symbolic yet deeply meaningful act. In some camps, a practical problem arose that reflected the scale of the tragedy. The available land was insufficient. In these cases, the Allies had to extend burial areas into the surrounding areas, creating improvised cemeteries that stretched beyond the camp perimeter. This occurred in Buchenwald, where nearby hills were used as additional sites. Sometimes the Allies expropriated private land or farmland, leaving written notices to inform the owners later. The priority was to guarantee a safe, delineated place where the remains could rest without risk of disturbance. The improvised cemeteries were not silent. During the first weeks, the constant sounds of shovels, military vehicles, voices mixed with instructions and prayers could be heard. But as the days went by, the fresh mounds of earth began to settle. Wooden crosses aged under the sun and rain, stakes leaned with the wind, paths marked by soldiers disappeared. The landscape changed rapidly, and with it arose a new concern: who would maintain these sites when the troops withdrew? The Allies understood that these cemeteries could not be abandoned. They knew that memory had to be preserved, even if initially in a rudimentary manner. For this reason, they tasked the military occupation governments and Jewish aid organizations with recording, marking, and maintaining these sites. The first reports on temporary cemeteries for camp victims began circulating in 1945, detailing location, approximate number of graves, and land condition. These documents would later prove essential in transforming many of these improvised spaces into permanent memorials. Some survivors actively participated in this process. Despite their physical frailty, they insisted on walking to the graves to place stones, a traditional Jewish gesture of respect, or to recite prayers for those who could not be identified. Others simply stood silently, observing the mounds as if trying to recognize them. For many, these improvised cemeteries were the closest they would have to a family grave. They knew that their parents, siblings, children, or friends might be among the nameless bodies, and this thought gave an intimate dimension to these collective spaces. Over time, these improvised cemeteries began to shape the narrative environment of the liberated camps. They were not just burial places. They were physical documents of the scale of the genocide, places where the earth had literally absorbed the evidence of the crime. This awareness changed the way the Allies engaged with these sites, prompting them to develop preservation policies and decide how to deal with the German citizens living around the camps. The Allied orders to force German citizens to bury the victims. In the first days after the liberation of the concentration camps, the Allies faced a dual need: to control a health catastrophe and, at the same time, confront the systematic denial of a large part of the German population. Many residents of nearby towns and villages claimed to know nothing, hear nothing, see nothing. Some said the smell came from factories, trenches, or routine military incinerations. Others believed the striped uniforms belonged to violent criminals, not entire families torn from their homes. And many, whether out of fear, convenience, or true self-deception, repeated that they had never approached the camp walls too closely. For the Allied commanders, this reaction was not only implausible, it was morally unsustainable. After seeing with their own eyes the mountains of corpses, the open graves, the clogged crematoria, and the survivors reduced to living skeletons, any claim of complete ignorance sounded like evasion. It was then that the US, British, and Soviet commanders made a decisive decision. German citizens would be forced to see, acknowledge, and bury the victims of crimes committed on their own territory. Orders began circulating in late April 1945. In Dachau, American soldiers gathered the residents of the town of the same name to take them personally to the camp. Some arrived on foot, others were escorted in military trucks. Footage shows columns of men and women with expressions of confusion, fear, and in some cases open shame. Armed soldiers guided them to the yards where the corpses were still exposed, making it clear with harsh gestures that they had to look without turning away. Cameras captured the reactions of many. Some cried, others turned their heads, others seemed paralyzed before the piles of bodies. The order was not limited to observation. In Dachau, US officers instructed civilians to dig mass graves and transport bodies. They could not touch the corpses directly, as the health risk was too high, but had to use shovels, wheelbarrows and tools under Allied supervision. From young to old, everyone participated in the burial of hundreds of victims. Many civilians later claimed it was the most traumatic experience of their lives. Others described it as a humiliating obligation. For the Allies, however, it was an act of minimal justice, that those who had lived just a few kilometers from the horror would physically face the reality of what had occurred. In Buchenwald, the Americans applied a similar policy. They summoned the residents of Weimar, a culturally significant city and birthplace of literary and philosophical figures, to walk to the camp and observe the bodies arranged in rows across the yards. Images show women with hands over their mouths, men frowning, young people unable to hold their gaze. Many had not imagined the scale of the crime unfolding so close to their daily lives. The Americans then ordered some to participate in the burial, although the process in Buchenwald was less physically demanding than in Dachau, due to prior organization by the Americans and the initial work carried out by survivors. In Bergen-Belsen, the British took an even more systematic approach. They gathered residents of nearby villages, escorted them to the camp, and forced them to walk around the freshly opened graves. There, they had to observe the number of corpses, the extent of the disturbed ground, and the size of the mounds. Contemporary photographs show groups of villagers with unmistakably shocked expressions. The British, aware of the propaganda and judicial importance of these reactions, filmed the entire process. They wanted to document not only the crime, but also the moral impact on those who had lived nearby for years without intervening. In some cases, civilians' reactions were tense. Some attempted to argue with the soldiers, claiming they had also suffered, that their children had died in the war, that they were not responsible for the actions of the SS. Allied officers responded with short, decisive phrases: "Look, dig, bury." There was no room for debate. The priority was to ensure that the German people could not later claim they had never seen what was found in the camps. The Soviets adopted a harsher approach. In Majdanek and other liberated camps in the east, they forced the local population to observe human remains, intact crematoria, and warehouses filled with objects belonging to the victims. In some places, civilians were forced to collect bone fragments and transport them to mass graves. The Soviet method had a more punitive tone. It was not only about teaching, but also about symbolically punishing those who had lived under the Nazi system. In all cases, the Allied intention was twofold. On the one hand, to control the health risk by quickly burying the bodies. On the other, to morally confront the German population with the genocide. The goal was to break the psychological barrier of "I didn't know," to expose indifference or passivity, and to establish in the collective memory the historical responsibility of an entire country. Although not all German citizens had participated directly, the Allies considered it vital that no one could claim complete ignorance. This process left visual records that today form part of the historical memory archive of the Holocaust. Photographs of elderly women walking among corpses, images of men lifting shovels next to deep graves, shots of children observing with bewildered expressions piles of bodies before they were buried. These images circulate today in museums, memorials, and military archives as testimonies of that moment when the war was not only won on the battlefield, but also on the symbolic ground of truth. Most civilians who participated in these burials left few recorded words. Later, personal memories describe deep discomfort, shame, confusion, or disbelief. Some, confronted with the evidence, admitted that they had preferred not to ask too many questions during the war. Others insisted they had been misled by Nazi propaganda, and there were those who, even after seeing the bodies, maintained reservations, partial denials, or ideological justifications. But the experience of burying victims under Allied supervision left an indelible mark on the lives of thousands of Germans. Photographic and film documentation as judicial evidence. When the Allies entered the concentration and extermination camps, they quickly realized that what they were seeing needed not only to be attended to, cleaned, or buried, it needed to be documented. Those scenes, such as open pits, stacked bodies, still hot crematoria, emaciated survivors, and warehouses of personal belongings, constituted evidence of the most systematic and organized crime the modern world had ever witnessed. Verbal accounts were not enough. Medical reports were not enough. It was essential to visually record every corner, every corpse, every building. Even then, the Allies knew that one day there would be those who would try to deny what had happened. Photographic and film teams began operating almost immediately. Specialized units of the US Signal Corps, British cameramen from the Army Film and Photographic Unit, and Soviet operators from state film studios were sent to the camps within hours or days after their liberation. The instruction was direct: film everything. Leave no detail unrecorded, do not soften scenes, do not hide what might be too disturbing. The intention was not sensational but forensic, to produce an irrefutable archive that could stand up in an international court. In Bergen-Belsen, for example, the British filmed extensive footage that today forms some of the harshest visual records of the 20th century. Soldiers are seen walking among unrecognizable bodies, open pits ready to be closed, bulldozers pushing corpses into deep trenches, and doctors attending survivors barely able to stay alive. The cameras moved slowly, without abrupt cuts, as if the operators wanted to ensure that no one could doubt in the future what was being recorded. In Buchenwald, the Americans documented not only the corpses but also workshops where grotesque objects were made from human remains, lamps made of skin, books bound with leather taken from prisoners, collections of skulls and bone fragments stored as pseudo-scientific curiosities. Although many of these items were destroyed by the SS before fleeing, some remained intact enough to be photographed and later presented at the Nuremberg trials. The cameras also recorded the crematoria, ash depots, overcrowded barracks, and yards where the dead had been left in the last days. The Soviets, upon liberating Auschwitz, Majdanek, and other eastern camps, captured images that still shock today: piles of shoes, tons of human hair packed in sacks, suitcases labeled with victims' names, orthopedic prostheses removed from bodies before incineration. They filmed survivors walking in rows, some with blank stares, others trying to narrate what had happened. Unlike the British or Americans, whose documentary style sought sobriety, Soviet operators tended to emphasize the emotional dimension, showing faces and reactions more directly. But the shared goal was the same: to bear witness. The documentation procedure included several stages. First, the field was surveyed to identify the most critical areas: the crematoria, the yards with corpses, the open pits, the most deteriorated barracks. Then, panoramic shots were taken to record the extent of the site. Afterwards, the cameras focused on specific details: the number tattooed on an arm, the tattered clothing of a deceased prisoner, the ovens still blackened from recent heat, the personal items stacked in entire rooms. One of the most important challenges was balancing the need to record everything with the respect due to the victims. Operators were aware that they were filming human beings who had been murdered, not elements of a staged scene. Many cameramen noted in their diaries the emotional difficulty of their task. Some said the camera shook in their hands. Others described that despite seeking a technical focus, it was impossible to ignore the smell, the silence, or the absolute stillness of the bodies. In addition to the images, the Allies began producing maps, diagrams, and detailed schematics. In Dachau and Buchenwald, military engineers drew plans indicating the location of the ovens, the arrangement of the barracks, the internal transport routes, and the places where bodies had been found. Each plan became additional evidence that could be presented to judges, lawyers, or experts. Photography also played a fundamental role. Thousands of still images were taken from different angles with natural and artificial lighting by day and night. Military photographers received precise instructions: record the murders not as individual acts but as structural phenomena. Therefore, they photographed piles of bodies instead of isolated individuals, storage rooms full of belongings, structures designed for mass killing. These images, later reproduced in official reports, diaries, magazines, and documentaries, showed the world that this was not a series of isolated excesses but an industrialized system of extermination. One of the most important decisions was to present the images without filters. They were not edited to soften scenes or avoid intense reactions. No actors or reenactments were used. What is seen in the Allied documentaries is exactly what was found: decomposing bodies, skeletal survivors, saturated barracks, ovens full of human ashes. The purpose was to prevent future generations from questioning the veracity of the Holocaust. The rawness within the ethical limit of avoiding morbid fascination was therefore a legal, not cinematic tool. When survivors regained some strength, they also began to give testimony in front of cameras. They spoke in their native languages, narrating experiences that they could often barely articulate. The cameras captured the tension in their voices, the trembling of their hands, the difficulty in explaining events that exceeded any comprehension. These recordings would later be used as part of the testimonial evidence corpus. Captured Nazis were also filmed. In Dachau, for example, the Americans recorded preliminary interrogations of guards and administrative staff. Although many tried to minimize their responsibility, the cameras recorded their contradictions, nervousness, and inability to explain the scale of the crimes. These recordings served to counter future defenses during trials. The immediate effect of this documentation was striking. The films were shown in European cinemas so that European citizens could see what had been discovered. In Germany, screening was mandatory in some cities under Allied administration. Reactions ranged from horror and disbelief to awkward, absolute silence. Some viewers openly cried, others stared, unable to look away, but all left the theaters with the evidence imprinted on their retinas. In the United States and the United Kingdom, the images were broadcast through news and press. Authorities understood that the world had to grasp, without intermediaries, what had occurred. The Allied films became an act of global communication aimed at confronting denial before it could begin. Yet the ultimate goal of all this documentation was not merely to show, it was to judge. The images were evidence, not propaganda. Therefore, they were meticulously preserved, with descriptions, dates, locations, and testimonies that could later be cross-checked. By mid-1945, legal teams began selecting which of these images would be presented in Nuremberg. Photographs, films, medical reports, filmed testimonies, and maps formed one of the strongest documentary bases in modern legal history. The cameramen did not know at the time, but they were building the most important visual archive ever used in an international court. Their task did not end with pressing the record button. It ended with preserving the memory of a crime the world was only beginning to comprehend. Forensic investigation of extermination methods. When the Allies managed to stabilize the camps, bury the dead, and assist the most critical survivors, a new phase of work emerged, scientifically understanding how the victims had died. It was not enough to show images or collect testimonies. Future courts would require precise medical evidence, detailed analyses, and conclusions based on rigorous methods. This is how forensic investigation in the liberated concentration camps was born, a painful, necessary, and deeply revealing process that sought to reconstruct from the bodies the patterns of Nazi extermination. The first forensic teams consisted of military doctors, pathologists, epidemic specialists, and in some cases urgently summoned civilian scientists. Many had no prior experience with catastrophes of this magnitude. They had studied individual murders, accidents, and limited epidemics, but they had never faced thousands of corpses weakened by extreme hunger, advanced diseases, and systematic violence. The scene before them challenged any scientific precedent. The analysis began with a basic difficulty. Most bodies showed multiple overlapping causes of death. Extreme malnutrition, for example, made it almost impossible to distinguish between death by starvation, disease, or organ collapse. In many cases, the body was so deteriorated that no fatty tissue remained, the skin adhered to the bones, and internal organs showed severe atrophy. These signs in themselves constituted forensic evidence. They demonstrated that the victims had been subjected to prolonged hunger, minimal rations, and excessive physical exertion. One of the earliest and most repeated forensic findings was the presence of advanced diseases that under normal circumstances could have been treated. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, lung infections, skin infections, and sepsis were common among the analyzed bodies. From a scientific perspective, the important point was not only the presence of these diseases but their scale. The camps had created perfect conditions for the spread and acceleration of deadly epidemics. Medical reports indicated that lack of hygiene, absence of heating, extreme overcrowding, and malnutrition had weakened the prisoners so much that any illness became a death sentence. Pathologists also found clear evidence of physical abuse. Many bodies had poorly healed fractures, bruises, irregularly healed wounds, belt marks, or blows from rifle butts. In other victims, signs of torture or systematic punishment were identified: broken ribs, displaced vertebrae, fractured hand bones in patterns compatible with intensive forced labor. Although these findings did not always allow the determination of the final cause of death, they revealed the environment of constant brutality to which prisoners were subjected. In camps where crematoria existed, forensic investigation extended to the residues. Experts analyzed ashes, bone fragments, and partially cremated remains found near ovens or in open incineration pits. In some locations, the Nazis had attempted to destroy evidence by mixing ashes with soil or dispersing them in rivers and fields. However, specialists were able to identify human fragments through structural bone analysis, proving that these remains corresponded to mass cremations. The presence of multiple individuals mixed in a single set of ashes confirmed the industrialized nature of the extermination. The analysis of gas chambers and adjacent structures was also crucial. In Auschwitz, the Soviets found chemical traces on the chamber walls, suggesting repeated use of Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide. Although the Nazis had blown up parts of the buildings before fleeing, some surfaces remained sufficiently intact to allow preliminary studies. Forensic experts identified bluish stains known as Prussian blue, typical of the chemical reaction of Zyklon B with porous materials. Although these tests were not the primary evidence in the trials, since testimonies, documents, and remaining structures were more than sufficient, they provided additional technical evidence about the methods of murder. In other camps, such as Majdanek, the crematoria remained almost intact, allowing specialists to study the machinery and understand its actual capacity. Researchers calculated how many bodies could be incinerated per day, how much wood or coal was needed, and how long the process took. These calculations were essential to refute claims by some captured individuals who tried to minimize the scale of the extermination. The numbers left no doubt. The ovens were designed to operate continuously day and night. Forensic reports also included recommendations on the treatment of survivors. Many prisoners were so weakened that a medical error could be fatal. Allied doctors described refeeding syndromes, cardiac collapses, and internal complications arising from attempting to feed those who had subsisted on minimal rations for months too quickly. These medical documents not only accounted for the physical condition of the liberated, they indirectly proved the degree of criminal negligence to which they had been subjected. One of the most difficult aspects for investigators was the analysis of bodies found in mass graves. There, the corpses were mixed without order or separation. Advanced decomposition made it impossible to distinguish precise injuries. But some patterns were visible despite the deterioration. In certain graves, the bodies showed signs of execution. Shots to the back of the head, characteristic postures of instant death, bullet holes in the skull. In other graves, the pattern was different. Groups of women, children, and elderly mixed without visible wounds, suggesting death from hunger, disease, or extreme exhaustion rather than direct execution. The information collected in these investigations became a scientific archive of incalculable value. The detailed reports were translated into several languages, sent to London, Washington, and Moscow, and eventually presented before international courts. These documents had a key advantage. They were impartial. The doctors wrote from empirical observation, without political interpretation, without speculation. The bodies alone narrated the process of physical destruction to which the victims had been subjected. Some forensic experts left personal testimonies about the impact this task had on them. A British doctor wrote that he had never seen bodies so weakened without a prolonged, deliberately lethal famine being involved. An American pathologist stated that when opening the bodies, what he found was not only disease, but evidence of an entire system dedicated to destroying lives down to the last breath. The Soviets, more reserved in their personal writings, nevertheless recorded the phrase mass annihilation in numerous official reports. Forensic investigation served not only to demonstrate how the victims died, but also to refute the initial denials. Some captured Nazi officers tried to claim that the deaths were due to inevitable epidemics or wartime conditions. The forensic experts demonstrated that the diseases were not a consequence of the conflict, but of deliberate policies, planned starvation, extreme overcrowding, forced labor, absolute lack of care. Every bone, every tissue, every injury spoke louder than any defensive statement. The forensic archives thus became one of the most important technical foundations for the trials to come. They allowed causal chains to be established, patterns to be demonstrated, and administrative decisions to be linked with lethal outcomes, and above all, they reminded the world that behind every number was a real body, a human being whose suffering could be studied with scientific precision. The capture and interrogation of camp personnel. While forensic doctors analyzed bodies and cameramen recorded the physical evidence of genocide, another crucial operation advanced in parallel: the capture, identification, and interrogation of personnel who had administered, supervised, or collaborated with concentration and extermination camps. In the chaos of the final months of the war, thousands of SS members tried to flee, blend in with civilians, or destroy any documentary trace linking them to the crimes committed. For the Allies, locating them became a race against time. In many cases, capture began within the camps themselves in the first hours after liberation. Some guards did not escape, or believing they could convince the Allies they were merely administrative staff, remained at their posts. That expectation collapsed immediately when Allied soldiers saw the scenes of horror inside the camp. Those captured were lined up, disarmed, and subjected to preliminary interrogations, often just meters from the bodies of their victims. In Dachau, the Americans found several guards still in uniform. Some tried to justify themselves by saying they were only following orders, a phrase that would soon become the defensive slogan of hundreds of officers. Others claimed to have been assigned to administrative tasks, minimizing any connection to executions or punishments. But the surviving prisoners, upon seeing their former captors, immediately stepped forward to identify them. The Allies then began to separate suspects according to direct accusations from the survivors. This improvised process, charged with extreme emotions, was the first step in reconstructing the chain of responsibility within the camp. In Buchenwald, the capture of Nazi personnel was particularly significant. The camp commander, Hermann Pister, had fled before the Americans arrived, but other senior officers had neither time nor means to escape. Among them was Ilse Koch, wife of the former commander Karl Koch and known for her brutality. Her arrest shocked even experienced soldiers. The firmness of her demeanor contrasted with the tales of cruelty recounted by the prisoners. Initial interrogations revealed a pattern that would be repeated in other camps: denial, minimization, and attribution of responsibility to absent superiors. In Bergen-Belsen, the British captured Josef Kramer, the Butcher of Belsen, whose sinister reputation was already known to Allied intelligence services. When soldiers found him, Kramer presented a cold, seemingly cooperative attitude, insisting he had done everything possible to prevent the sanitary catastrophe of the past weeks. Footage of his arrest shows an impassive man walking among the bodies without showing any emotion. His interrogation would later reveal contradictions, deliberate omissions, and a complete understanding of his role in the death system he had directed. In Auschwitz, the Soviets detained part of the personnel who had failed to flee during the evacuation. Among them were members of the internal administration, auxiliary guards, and nurses of the women's camp. Unlike British and American interrogations, which relied on documentary methods oriented toward trial, the Soviets emphasized immediate confession. The goal was twofold: to establish responsibility and to reinforce the propagandistic record of Nazi crimes. The interrogated knew that any contradiction could quickly be used against them. The capture of auxiliary personnel, many of them Ukrainians, Latvians, or from other occupied regions, was also crucial. These collaborators were responsible for specific tasks: guarding prisoners, operating crematoria, patrolling the perimeters, or supervising forced labor. Many tried to escape by dressing in civilian clothes or claiming to be ordinary workers recruited by the Reich. However, survivors often recognized them by voice, physique, or behavior patterns. Identification lines became a fast and effective method. Prisoners, still weakened, pointed without hesitation to those who had mistreated, beaten, or sent them to death. Formal interrogations began with an analysis of available documentation, internal lists, barracks records, service sheets. Although the Nazis had destroyed much of the documentation, some files survived, especially in camps where evacuation was rushed. These fragments allowed reconstructing schedules, specific functions, and hierarchical structures. Based on them, interrogators could confront detainees with direct evidence, reducing the possibility of denial. In many cases, interrogations revealed crucial details about the internal organization of the camps. Some guards described the selection methods when trains arrived, Others explained how punishments were administered, how the crematoria operated, or how rations were distributed. Although these confessions often aimed to minimize personal responsibility, they contained valuable information for documenting the extermination system. Interrogators were skilled at detecting contradictions, inconsistencies, or attempts to shift blame onto deceased or missing superiors. The defensive strategies of Nazi personnel were surprisingly homogeneous. The most common was the insistence that they had acted only under orders. Another consisted of presenting themselves as mere administrative employees without direct contact with the prisoners. Some claimed that mass deaths were due to inevitable epidemics. Others stated they were unaware of gas chambers or executions. But the interrogators, armed with survivor testimonies, photographs, and medical records, dismantled these narratives again and again. The logical structure of each camp, meticulously designed to produce death, made it impossible to deny responsibility. During the interrogations, a revealing psychological pattern also emerged. Many guards displayed an almost mechanical obedience to the Nazi narrative even after the Reich's defeat. They repeated phrases about fighting against enemies of the state, about disciplinary work, or about fulfilling duty. For the Allied interrogators, this was further evidence of the deep indoctrination to which they had been subjected. Others, however, soon broke their defensive facade and offered precise details, perhaps hoping for leniency. Their information allowed the reconstruction of schedules, train lists, names of commanders, and locations of mass graves. As the months progressed, the detainees were transferred to prisoner camps where they awaited trial. Some attempted suicide. Others wrote letters insisting on their innocence or on the injustice of their capture. But for the Allies, the accumulated evidence was so vast that individual defenses seemed insignificant in the face of the crime itself. The interrogations did not only seek to hold specific individuals accountable. They also had a larger objective: to understand how an entire system had functioned, how hundreds of people had collaborated in industrial extermination processes without questioning them, how orders had been coordinated, and how secrecy had been maintained. Partial confessions allowed Allied investigators to reconstruct the full chain, from the commanders who ordered executions to the guards overseeing selection lines, through administrative staff managing records and doctors involved in experiments. The capture of concentration and extermination camp personnel profoundly transformed the Allies' understanding of the Nazi system. The voices of the perpetrators, now forced to explain their role, revealed a bureaucratic and human dimension of the crime that complemented the visual and medical evidence. And this information, organized in meticulous files, would serve as legal fuel for what was to come, forcing German civilians to see what had happened. As the Allies captured and interrogated the camp personnel, a growing conviction emerged. The German population had to face the horror that had been committed on their territory. It was not enough to arrest the direct perpetrators. It was necessary to force ordinary citizens, that is, the residents of cities, towns, and villages, who had lived only a few kilometers from the camps but had not directly participated in the Holocaust, to look at what they had ignored, accepted, or minimized for years. This public confrontation sought to break denial, shake consciences, and make clear that the crime had occurred in their very shadow. The decision was not improvised. Specific orders were issued from the Allied High Command. In each liberated camp, civilians from nearby areas were to be summoned to see the corpses, the barracks, the crematoria, and the mass graves. Field commanders had to ensure that no one could claim, in the years to come, that they were unaware of what had happened. It was a moral shock policy designed to register the collective reaction of a society that had been a passive, active, or silent accomplice of the Nazi regime. In Dachau, the order was applied with visual force, documented in still-preserved footage. The city's inhabitants, including teachers, merchants, housewives, clergy, and municipal officials, were escorted by US troops to the camp walls. Some tried to talk to one another, others walked silently, but all showed a mix of anxiety and resistance. They knew they were being taken to see something terrible. They did not know its full extent. As they passed through the gates, soldiers forced civilians to walk slowly among rows of still unburied corpses. Cameras captured varied reactions: women covering their mouths, elderly people swaying, men unable to hold their gaze, young people bursting into tears or freezing in place. The contrast between the everyday life of the town and the devastation inside the camp was too abrupt. Many civilians clung to defensive explanations. We didn't know, we didn't understand. They never let us in. We only saw smoke, we thought it was a factory. Soldiers pointed to the bodies. Now you know. In Buchenwald, the scene was even more symbolic. Americans led hundreds of Weimar residents through lice-infested barracks, torture rooms, forced labor chambers, and overcrowded corpse depots. The historical irony was brutal. Just a few kilometers from the country's cultural center, an industrialized system of death had operated. The images of Weimar citizens walking among the corpses contrasted sharply with the city's deep humanist tradition, producing an emotional and cultural shock deemed necessary by the Allies. The British implemented a similar policy in Bergen-Belsen. They gathered villagers and residents from nearby settlements, formed them into columns, and made them walk through the camp, past bodies still exposed and open graves where bulldozers worked tirelessly. Many civilians cried, others vomited, some tried to leave, but soldiers prevented them. The order was clear: see, understand, imprint on memory. The British filmed every moment, not to humiliate, but to provide a historical record that these Germans had been confronted with reality. In Soviet-liberated territories, the approach took a harsher, punitive tone. In Majdanek, for example, locals were forced to walk past piles of children's shoes, rooms full of clothing, bone remains, and intact gas chambers. The Soviets demanded that civilians collect bone fragments, clean contaminated areas, and assist in preparing mass graves. Their goal was not only to convey knowledge, but also to instill an explicit sense of shared guilt for allowing these centers to operate. Civilian reactions varied widely. Some collapsed emotionally, declaring they would never forget what they had seen. Others tried to justify themselves. We lived in fear. If we spoke, we were arrested. We thought the prisoners were dangerous criminals. Some adopted a defensive stance, claiming Nazi propaganda had hidden the camp's true nature. Yet the Allies pointed to the constant smell, the smoke from the crematoria, truck traffic, occasional gunfire, and the visible emaciated prisoners behind the fences. The question hanging in the air, rarely spoken aloud, was inevitable. Did no one really know? In many towns, the Allies forced mayors, local officials, and members of the Nazi Party to participate in work within the camp. They were assigned tasks such as moving bodies, repairing fences, cleaning barracks, or digging graves. The objective was not to physically or psychologically torture them, but to directly confront those who had been part of the administrative structure that allowed the camps to exist. One of the most striking moments occurred in a town near Nordhausen when citizens were brought to see the bodies of thousands of forced laborers who had died in underground tunnels used for the production of V-2 rockets. The images show villagers fainting, crying, or kneeling in shock. The scene left a deep mark on the collective memory of the place and became one of the clearest records of public confrontation with Nazi crimes. The psychological impact on the German population was enormous. Some experienced a kind of late moral awakening. Others, on the other hand, reinforced denial mechanisms and avoided emotional contact with what they saw. The Allies, however, considered that confrontation not optional. It was part of the process of denazification and the ethical reconstruction of Germany. They understood that remembering the horror was the first step to prevent it from happening again. Allied orders also led to an architectural and symbolic change. Improvised cemeteries became visible memorials. The mounds of earth were fenced off. Stakes, plaques, and signs were installed that still exist today. The fact that these cemeteries were located next to local communities ensured that the memory of the genocide was not locked behind administrative walls, but exposed to everyday view. As civilians were confronted and those responsible captured, another critical phase approached: the use of all this evidence in trials that would define the legal memory of the Holocaust. The use of evidence in the Nuremberg trials. When the war officially ended in May 1945, the Allies had already accumulated such a vast, overwhelming, and devastating amount of evidence that the next step seemed inevitable: to turn that archive into a legal instrument capable of exposing with surgical precision the functioning of the Nazi genocide. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal would be the stage where this evidence, consisting of photographs, films, autopsies, medical reports, seized objects, and survivor testimonies, would take legal form. And the handling of the bodies, their final fate, and their condition when found would become a central part of the case against the leaders of the Third Reich. Nuremberg was no ordinary trial. Never before in modern history had the victorious powers united to prosecute leaders of a defeated nation for crimes committed on an industrial scale. And never before had the human body in its most vulnerable condition been essential evidence in an international tribunal. What was shown there was not just documentary evidence, but the physical trace of the crime: bones, ashes, skin, teeth, photographs of bodies in mass graves, and footage of the exact moment the Allies discovered the camps. From the beginning, the prosecutors had a clear goal: let the images speak for themselves. They did not want excessive speeches or elaborate rhetoric. They wanted the tribunal, but above all the world, to see what British, American, and Soviet soldiers had seen. They wanted to show, without intermediaries, how the bodies were dragged, piled up, incinerated, or hastily buried in the last days. And they wanted that evidence to be so clear, so brutal, and so undeniable that no defense based on denial or obedience could survive the visual impact. US prosecutor Robert H. Jackson understood from day one that the images would be decisive. In one of the opening speeches, he stated that no crime had ever been so meticulously documented by the perpetrators themselves. Transport lists, crematorium records, reports of incineration capacity per hour, gas chamber plans, internal orders detailing the logistics of death. Added to this were the films taken by the Allies when liberating the camps, showing stacked bodies and freshly opened mass graves. The tribunal would, for the first time in history, become a direct witness to a massive crime recorded in real time. One of the most striking moments was the presentation of the US documentary Nazi concentration camps, produced by the Signal Corps. The nearly one-hour film was shown in the courtroom on November 29, 1945. The lights went out and the screen showed scenes filmed at Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and other camps. Mountains of corpses, skeletal bodies lying on the ground, bulldozers pushing human remains, open graves showing layers of victims buried on top of each other. The silence in the room was absolute. Many of the accused lowered their gaze. Others, like Hermann Goering, watched with tense but apparently controlled expressions. However, some defense attorneys could not hold their gaze. One of the Soviet interpreters later said it was impossible to describe the atmosphere of that moment. The air seemed to thicken, as if the entire room were witnessing something beyond human. The judges, each with strict legal training, maintained composure, but the power of the images was overwhelming. For the first time, an international tribunal used film as evidence. There was no possibility of arguing manipulation. The cameraman filmed directly without dramatic editing or unnecessary commentary. The scenes were as raw as they were sensibly bearable, but they did not avoid showing the magnitude of the crime. The film was followed by still photographs taken in the days after the liberation. Some showed bodies in positions that revealed death from extreme starvation, protruding bones, skin clinging to the skeleton, sunken abdomens, arms so thin they seemed incapable of supporting their own body weight. Other images showed open mass graves where corpses in various stages of decomposition could be seen, mixed together without clothing, without identification. These photographs were incorporated into official documents with detailed annotations, date, place, military unit that took them, description of the condition of the bodies. Forensic reports were also crucial. British, American, and Soviet doctors testified in court, presenting studies on intentional malnutrition, untreated diseases, signs of violence, mass executions, and cremated remains. They explained how the analysis of bodies found in graves and crematoria revealed systematic patterns. These were not random deaths, but the result of calculated policies, ration reductions, forced labor, deliberate medical neglect, epidemics caused by deliberately inhumane conditions. Prosecutors also presented objects found in the camps: gold teeth extracted from corpses, uncremated bone fragments, suitcases labeled with victims' names, prosthetics accumulated in entire rooms. The physical accumulation of these objects in the courtroom was overwhelming. At one point during the trial, a large board was displayed showing the estimated number of bodies cremated in Auschwitz each day according to the Nazis' own records. The industrialized capacity for extermination was thus demonstrated not only in testimony but in official figures. Survivor testimonies added a human dimension. Some testified with trembling voices about daily deaths in the barracks, selections in train cars, and the routine of watching fellow prisoners die during the night. Others described seeing bodies dragged by exhausted prisoners, being forced to dig mass graves or witnessing the incineration of thousands. Individual stories integrated with the forensic and visual record, completing an irrefutable picture. The defendants, for their part, attempted defensive strategies that clashed directly with the evidence. Göring claimed he had never ordered exterminations, stating his role was military. Others claimed ignorance of the methods used in the camps. Some blamed Himmler, local commanders, or administrative officials, but each denial collided with a wall of physical evidence: the bodies, the remains, the documents, the films. The court understood that the strongest evidence was not statements, but the bodies themselves. The presence of nameless, stacked, burned, or abandoned corpses became silent testimony that no defense could dismantle. Images of bodies buried by bulldozers, overflowing graves, saturated crematoria, and barracks filled with the dying became the backbone of the case against the genocide perpetrators. The final judgment affirmed that the crimes proven were unique in their scale and cruelty, and that the visual and forensic evidence presented was of unprecedented force. The corpses had spoken, even without names, and their message was recorded forever in the legal records of history.